A number of years ago, a hurricane had swept through Florida, and they were interviewing a man on the news because the majority of his neighborhood had been completely wiped out by the hurricane. But his house was still standing. And so the reporter had one basic question for him. He said, "Why is your house still standing and the others are gone?" He said, "Well, you see, that's quite simple. The state puts out instructions for how you're to build your home if you want it to survive hurricanes. I built mine according to the instructions. They didn't." And I think there's a lot to that principle, that things that withstand time don't happen on accident. That if they're done, and if they survive, and if they thrive, it's because we've been following instructions somewhere along the way. Those instructions are there for a reason. And when it comes to, and you look at marriages, great marriages don't happen by accident. It's not that two people have more, quote, chemistry than the other, and it's not that two people have, they're just special personalities and that's why their marriage is so great. It's because they chose to work at it. That is the only way a great marriage happens, is if the two parties involved choose to work at it and to make it that way. And that's something that has to be understood, and it has to be built correctly. And if we do it the way that God says do it, it's amazing how easily, easily may not be the best term, but it does flow and it does come together the way that it's supposed to. And so tonight I want us to think about building an intimate marriage. Now, when most people hear the word intimate or intimacy, they automatically run in one direction, which they should not run. They believe when you're talking about intimacy that you must be speaking about the physical relationship between a husband and a wife. But this is something that our world has yet to understand, and unfortunately many people in the church still don't understand it, is that, quote, physical intimacy, they try and divorce physical intimacy from everyday marriage. Physical intimacy is nothing but an outward expression of the inward connection that you have created all throughout the week and all throughout the month and all throughout the year and all throughout your marriage. It comes and it expresses itself physically, but intimacy is built. It's about opening your life and opening your heart to one another and being willing to be honest with one another. The physical relationship just mirrors that, okay? So, as we think about that tonight, we're going to talk about and look at that a little bit more in detail. And so I want us to first of all kind of explain a little bit more what we mean by building an intimate marriage. Look at some essentials that are three essentials that we have to keep in mind. And then I want us to spend the majority of our time talking about some areas where we need to exert effort if we want to have it. So first of all, and if you have your Bible, go ahead and be turning to the Song of Solomon. We will be here in certain portions throughout the study. And the Song of Solomon, I will go ahead and give my soapbox on this too. When God gives us a book on marriage, and that's what the Song of Solomon is, and we refuse to teach it and talk about it, don't be surprised if marriages in churches are not what they should be. God has given us a book that describes every stage of marriage, from their dating relationship to their engagement, to their early marriage, and to their latter years of marriage. God has given us this book. It talks to us about all these phases. And He tells us. Now, we kind of look at it and we say, but the language is kind of weird. Have you listened to music lately? I mean, country music, and I like country music, but country music is not very flattering in its approach to women. But we think, oh, that's normal. These guys who talk about doves and you have dove's eyes, that's weird. Turn on the radio and pay closer attention to what you're listening to. You might find that actually this is extremely thoughtful and creative, and there's such great intimacy and affection behind the terms that are being used in the Song of Solomon. So first of all, let's begin as we explaining this, first of all, with the word building. With the word building. To build something, of course, is to build or to devise fitting parts and elements together. So you're taking two things and you're bringing them together, or multiple things and bringing them together to build a singular structure. And in marriage, what you're doing is you're taking two individual people and you're making them one. You're bringing them together. You're building them together, building them with stability. Now, in the Song of Solomon, chapter 1, verse 16, this is Shulamith, the girlfriend slash fiance, as we would understand it. This is her speaking to Solomon. She says, "Behold, you are beautiful, my beloved, truly delightful. Our couch is green, the beams of our house are cedar, and our rafters are pine." You know, the air is working, and my glasses are fogging up on me. But anyway, that's why, by the way, I have to take them on and off a lot, because they get foggy. But anyway, what they're saying here, when you say a couch is green, green is a sign of what? Vibrancy. It's life. Our relationship is vibrant, it's prospering. And in our house, they're made of cedars and fine pines. These are very sturdy and also very expensive pieces of wood in this particular culture. What is she saying? She's telling him, we have a solid relationship. We have this house, this structure represents our relationship, and we have a solid relationship with one another. It's vibrant and it's growing. And it's not being something that's being said as an individual being naive. Then number 2, we get to the idea of intimacy. And the word intimacy, as it is defined technically, pertaining to the innermost character of a thing. And so intimacy between two people, a husband and wife, is the innermost character of who they are, bearing the innermost portions of their soul to one another. And unfortunately, in a lot of relationships, that's not there. That's not there. There's not a willingness to share. And you know, based on experience, it's kind of 50-50, really. Husbands and wives, in my experience, they both had some problems on these fronts, sharing with one another and building this. But if you do it the right way and you build this intimate relationship, listen to what he says in chapter 8, verses 6 and 7. It says, "Set me as a seal upon your heart and as a seal upon your arm, for love is strong as death, jealousy is fierce as the grave. It flashes or a flash of fire, the very flame of the Lord." Now watch this. "Many waters cannot quench love, neither can floods drown it." Now what did he just compare love to? Fire. No amount of water could put this fire out. And then he says, "If a man offered for love all the wealth of his house, he would utterly be despised." I'll trade you all the money in the world if you give up the person you love. No chance. That's what he's saying. There's no chance. Now, a lot of people would, and even in joking, but here's the thing about joking sometimes. And listen, I'm not an anti-joke. You know, we need to learn to be able to not be so uptight about everything in life. But there comes a point when a joke starts crossing a line. And there comes a point when a person is saying in a joke what they really feel. And so we need to be cautious about those things. And because what they're revealing is that they may not have a good relationship with their spouse with the way that they're speaking of it. It can be quite revealing. And so what we have to remember is that when we tell a joke or we do something that paints our spouse in a negative light, if we're truly one, that's kind of like painting ourselves in a negative light. And so we have to be cautious there, because that can be a roadblock to intimacy. Then we have this word marriage. This relationship between two spouses, the Bible defines it very clearly. Genesis 2 and verse 24, "For this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife." Now, we have to be, in our culture, we need to define that a little bit more specifically than in cultures past. We need to assert, first of all, that it is genetic male, genetic female. Okay? Based upon scientific advancements, transgender issues, we need to understand that we're talking about not what the body necessarily looks like, but genetically, a male and a female. That's the way God defines marriage, and that's not an unloving thing to say that that's the way God defines it. It doesn't mean you don't care about other people. It doesn't mean you don't care with people who who struggle with some of these issues, whether it be transgender issues or same-sex attraction or something along those lines. But changing God's word doesn't help anybody. And so we have to stick with the biblical definition of what marriage is between a man, a genetic male, and a genetic female. And we have to make that distinction because of current circumstances. We also need to remember that for a marriage to be recognized by God, okay? Now understand that. A government may recognize a marriage as something when God does not recognize it as a marriage. Okay? And I'm not just talking about there between same-sex marriage or something along those lines. I mean even amongst genetic males and genetic females. To be married, for two people to qualify to be married, both of them must fall into one of three categories according to Scripture. They either first have to have never been married before. That's 1 Corinthians 7, 25 to 28. To the unmarried I say, and he's giving them his counsel based upon the present distress. So a person who has never been married obviously has the right to be married. A person who is a widow or widower, Romans 7, 1 through 4. Or the person who is the innocent party, what we call it in a divorce, Matthew 19 and verse 9. That is, their spouse, had they been married before, their spouse cheated on them. Okay? And so, or committed adultery, to just be more explicit with it. And that's what Jesus said. Whoever divorces his wife, except it be for, some translations say sexual immorality. The idea is fornication. It's porneia. It's a broad, encompassing term. That if you do that without being the innocent party, when you remarry, you commit adultery. And your marriage is considered adulterous. And actually, technically, is not recognized as a marriage in the eyes of God. It's simply recognized as an adulterous relationship. Okay? So, both parties have to fall into one of those three categories. Otherwise, their marriage would not be, and that's why we discuss it as scriptural. It does not adhere to the way God has designed marriage to work. So, that's the idea behind marriage. Two people weaving their lives together according to the standard of God. All right, now let's move and talk about three essential areas. The first thing we need to remember is that God created it. Now, why do we need to remember that God created it? Genesis 2, 18 through 25, we've talked about at detail before. I think it was during COVID at some point, so I know it's archived somewhere. But God creates marriage because he says it's not good that man should be alone. So God created it. Now, why is that point so important? Because it means he regulates it. It means he knows how it works best. Okay? He knows how it works best. Because a lot of times what ends up happening, well, anyway, I'll get to that here in just a second. But we have to if I don't understand the basic premise that God created it, and when I get married, I am involving myself, even if I'm not a religious person, I'm involving God in that relationship. You see, what a lot of people don't realize is this. When we do marriage vows, if you pay close attention to marriage vows, before you ever make a promise to your spouse, you actually make a promise to God first. We call them vertical and horizontal vows. You actually make a vow to God vertically before you ever make a vow to your spouse horizontally. Do you promise to take this person, to have them, to love them in sickness and health, for rich, all these different things? We're making a connection before God. We're promising to God to take care of the individual before us. And then when we turn to one another and we exchange vows, those are horizontal vows. We're making those to each other, but they are preceded by vertical vows that you make before God. And God is very serious about vows that we make. He takes it very seriously. So first, that God created it. Number two, that God controls it. Jesus has given a very clear indication of what he wants marriage to be. Okay? Now, again, this is not to throw salt in the wounds of anyone who has been through divorce, who has been through. Listen, that's an extremely difficult, and that's a way understatement. But it's an extremely difficult thing to go through a divorce. Okay? But what we have to understand is that God has a design for marriage, and it is possible. You know, I've heard some people say through the years, as we talk about the innocent party in a divorce, they say, is anyone ever truly innocent? That's the way they try and preach it. You know, you make mistakes along the way, and my question to them, or my statement to them is, if you don't think anybody is truly innocent, you need to tell Jesus that, because he didn't believe that. Because Jesus spoke very clearly in Matthew 19:9, you can be an innocent party in a divorce. Okay? Just because you make some mistakes in your marriage and your spouse cheats on you, that doesn't mean that you're just as guilty as they are. That's ridiculous. And so God controls it, and this is his idea behind it. He was asked about divorce in Matthew 19, and many times we talk about verse 9, but we miss everything that precedes it. They ask him a question about divorce because they're trying to put him on the horns of a dilemma, because there are two famous rabbis that lived just before Jesus, and people broke into two schools of thought. And so they thought, however he answers, we can get him in trouble. But they basically said, is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for every cause? Jesus said, haven't you read? You see, they were expecting Jesus to quote Deuteronomy 24 and give an exegesis of the laws, regulations concerning divorce. He did not do that. He quoted Genesis 2 and said, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife. And then he says in verse 6, what God has joined together, let not man separate. So he defined marriage as a man and a woman for life. Then when they continued to ask him, he said, yes, there is an exception to that. If adultery is committed, there is certainly an exception to that. So God is in control of it. That's his idea. Now, it doesn't always work out that way. But that's the ideal that God has in mind. Now, so a person may be thinking, well, if I've been through a divorce, does that make me a failure? Did I not live up to God's standard? No. When your spouse chooses to go somewhere else, they're not living up to God's standards. That's not your fault. That's not yours to carry. Okay? Don't carry guilt that Jesus doesn't ascribe to you. Then number 3, we have to remember that God counsels it. In 2 Peter chapter 1 and verse 3, Peter opens up saying that God has given us all things that pertain to life and godliness. Our relationship with God, our relationship with other people. If God creates marriage, he's going to counsel it. He's going to teach us how it works best. Okay? Now, the reason why I emphasize that point is this. Please be careful who you take marriage advice from. I hear a lot of advice about marriage thrown around that just is not biblical. Okay? And I can tell you that in my marriage and family counseling class, where we went through about the 20 different basic approaches, that's what we did all semester, went through the 20 different approaches that people take toward marriage and family counseling. They all have their strengths and weaknesses. Okay? A lot of people are exclusively one particular approach. This is how you handle it. What our professor said, and I believed he was right, was that you need to take an integrative approach. There are positives in every one, and there are negatives. You need to take the positives of each one and integrate them all together in order to be able to help people. Because no one particular thing has it correct. For an example, a popular book amongst marriage circles, and for a long time I was a real champion of this book, but the older I've gotten, the more I kind of struggle with it, is the book His Needs, Her Needs. I struggle with the principles of that book the older I get. Because basically the premise is, and it's an old integrative approach, Harley didn't invent it like some people would think he did. There was somebody else who, I've got the textbook in my office if you want to go get it and read it. Somebody long before him developed this approach, Okay, he just made it a little more famous in America. But it basically says that each person has a love bank, and you should do things that deposit that. And so every person has a love bank, and every interaction you're either withdrawing from your relationship from them, you're making withdrawals because you've mistreated them or miscommunicated with them, or you're making deposits because you have positive interactions. And so you should continually seek to, basically it turns marriage into a transaction, which is something that's troublesome to me. And furthermore, I struggle with the concept that says, I will do for you if you do for me. I'll deposit for you if you deposit for me, because the Bible seems to say that I will love you regardless of how you treat me. And so we have to be careful about who we listen to. Okay? Marriage counselors are not created equal, nor are their approaches. And without being ugly, or trying not to be ugly, you probably shouldn't be taking marriage advice from a person who can't seem to have a successful marriage of their own at all. Because I've sat in many places, even in recent weeks, where I'm just minding my business. It's ball practice, ball game. I'm just reading my book. I just want to be left alone. Okay? I'm not trying to eavesdrop on anything, but when you talk incredibly loud, what other choice do I have but to hear it? Listen, I'm not listening to the advice that they were giving each other. I'm not surprised. I'm not surprised with our divorce problem. It just wasn't good. It was self-centered. It was selfish. It was manipulative. It was everything that's contrary to the way God says solve problems. So when we understand that God counsels it, I have to first run to Him and let Him explain to me how this thing is supposed to work. And even if I take advice from other people, if I get counseling from other people, I need to make sure that their counseling, their advice, is consistent with what the Bible is actually saying. Because that's not always true. All right? So with that in mind, let's look at the effort that we need to put forth as we think about how to build this relationship. Number one, there has to be a willingness in both parties. In the Song of Solomon, chapter 5, beginning in verse 2, this is the bride who's commonly called Shulamith as you study the book. She says, I slept, but my heart was awake, a sound. My beloved is knocking. Open the door to me, my sister, my love, my dove, my perfect one, for my head is wet with dew and my locks with the drops of night. And she says, I have put off my garment. How can I put it on? And I bathe my feet. How can I soil them? My beloved put his hand to the latch, and my heart was thrilled within me. I arose to open to my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, and my fingers with liquid myrrh, and on the handles of the bolt, that is, excitement is permeating through her fingertips. I opened to my beloved, but my beloved had turned and gone. I sought him. My soul failed me when he spoke. I sought him, but found him not. I called him, but he gave no answer. So what you've got is a marital spat going on kind of here. He's coming in from working in the field, and the door is already locked, and he says, open for me. And she says, what? I can't. I've already had my bath, my feet are clean, and I'm not going to get myself dirty. Not a good thing to do. Right? But then she realizes it. To her credit, she realizes what she is saying is selfish. And she moves to open the door, and she finds out that he is gone. Now, the principle I want us to take from it is there has to be, first of all, a willingness for us to change. Because a lot of people in marriage, they think the biggest problem in their marriage is the other person. If I could just get him to behave, or if I could just get her to behave and see things my way, we'd be great. You're assuming that your way is the right way. Be very scared of that idea. There has to be a willingness that says, you know what, even if I'm not doing what I need to be doing, I'm willing to change, and I'm willing to view the perspective of the other person. It is amazing. Look, men and women are very different, especially in the way they communicate. And if you're not willing to see from the other side, if you're not willing to see your spouse's point of view, which sometimes that gets deals with communication, you get a little sideways because of that. For an example, she's finally had enough of him leaving dirty clothes on the floor, and so she says, you need to pick up your clothes, or even more dramatic, more explosive than that idea. And he says, what's the big deal? They're just clothes. I work all the time. I'm tired. They're just clothes. Who cares? Well, first of all, what we actually have is a communication problem. Because first of all, she's not really mad about the clothes. That's not the point. What she's mad about is you don't care enough about me to help me. That's what she's really upset about. You're just adding one more thing on top of all the other things I got to do. It's not about the clothes. So it's about really learning how to communicate those things. But as a husband, if I'm not willing to see her perspective, I'm going to damage my relationship, even over something little. Listen, I promise you, and the Song of Solomon teaches this, the big issues that arise in your marriage, you are actually very likely to survive them. You're actually very likely to survive them. It's the little things that will destroy you. That's what Solomon means in chapter 2 when he says, we've got to make sure we keep the little foxes out of the vineyard. Why? Because the big foxes would jump up and just grab a grape off the vine. Little foxes couldn't reach them, so what'd they do? They chewed them down at the root. Big foxes would take one grape. Little foxes would take a whole vine. Your little problems are what are your big problems. And your big problems, they're survivable. So, there has to be a willingness to change, a willingness to view things from the other perspective. Number 2, there has to be openness that exists. The first thing is there has to be honesty. Honesty. Proverbs 6:16 through 19. These 6 things does the Lord hate. Yes, 7 are an abomination to him. 2 of those things have to do with lying. And a number of people, they put it like this. This is how they justify it in their mind. I'm just protecting her from what's going on. Listen, you will never protect your spouse by deceiving them. We will always do more damage to our spouse by deceiving them than we would if we just told them the truth. But number 2, and by the way, this comes down to little things. When your spouse looks at you and says, is something wrong with you? And you say no, and something is wrong with you, you are lying to them. We don't think about it that way. You should know. You should be able to read. Listen now. Not a one amongst us are mind readers. But if your spouse asks you, is something bothering you? And you don't tell them, we're lying to them. We are withholding information. We are actively deceiving them. But then you get the other side of the spectrum that says, yeah, I told them. Now, wait a minute. You can be honest without exploding on a person, too. And so there are 2 sides of that we really got to pay attention to. But even further than that, there has to be a vulnerability that exists. Look in chapter 1 and verse 5 to begin. This is her speaking again. She says, I am very dark but lovely. O daughters of Jerusalem, like tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon, do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has looked on me. My mother's sons were angry with me and made me keepers of the vineyard. And so basically what is going on is she's not a city girl, she's a country girl. She's got a deep tan on her body because she has to work out in the field. And what she's saying is she's self-conscious about that. And so he answers her, if you do not know, O most beautiful among women, follow the tracks of the flocks and pasture and your goats beside the shepherd's tent. I compare you, my love, to a mare among Pharaoh's chariots, and your cheeks are lovely with ornaments and your neck with strings of jewels. Now don't get lost in what's being said, and I wish we had time to flesh it out, but we don't. But what he is doing is reassuring her. Okay? Go down to chapter 2, verse 1, when she says, I am a rose of Sharon, a lily of the valleys. Now, the Sharon Valley was famous for its roses and lilies. They were everywhere. But watch what he says. He responds and says, a lily among brambles, so is my love among the young women. What's he saying? What is she saying first? She's basically saying, when I am a rose of Sharon, she's saying, I'm nothing special. And to Solomon's credit, he does not let that fly. He said, that's not true. You're not a rose amongst a valley of them. You're a rose in a bramble patch. You are special. You're different. You're mine. But do you see her openness, her vulnerability? This is one. If intimacy will never happen in a marriage if I can't be honest about my own insecurities. No matter how superficial we may think they are. I don't like the way that I look. I don't feel like I'm an attractive person. I don't feel like I'm a gifted person. I don't feel like this. I don't feel like that. If a husband and wife cannot discuss those things, they will never achieve what God intended marriage to be. And that is, you have a person who loves you and is built in and a champion for you and will help you to see yourself as you really are and not in the distorted way that we want to see ourselves. But here's why a lot of people struggle with that, is because they've been hurt in the past. They were willing to open up to someone, and somebody misused it. Somebody exploited it. And so they're afraid to do it again. Number 3, there has to be learning. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 7, you remember in that context, in 1 Peter chapter 3, he's talking to wives with unbelieving husbands, but then he turns to husbands and says, likewise, you husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge. How many of you ever heard this statement? You can't understand women. God didn't believe that. Do you know that? And furthermore, God didn't say you have to understand every woman on this planet. God said to men, there is one woman you have to understand, and that's your wife. It is your job to know her inside and out. Isn't it amazing that when we're dating, we want to know everything about them. We want to just learn everything that we can so that we can know how to treat them well and treat them with respect. And we get married and that stops. Now it's just annoyance, right? We have to constantly be studying who our spouse is, because here's one of the things that we have to understand. When we get married and we promise to love someone, we're not just promising to love who they are today. We're promising to love who they will be in 10 years, and who they will be in 20 years, and who they will be in 40 years. Because you will not be the same person over that span of time. There are changes that happen to all of us. And we have to be committed to loving that and understanding and knowing and processing those changes. So we have to actually pay attention to our spouses. Now, for men, that means, and I'm speaking in generalities, I'm not speaking as if, some people take these things personally. You're talking about me. No, I'm not. I'm talking in generalities, okay? For men, that means you're going to have to learn to turn your brain off and not think about work all the time and actually think about your spouse. And for many women, their struggle, as I have listened to them through the years in counseling sessions and different things along those lines, you have to remember your home runs in this order: God, husband, children. Not God, children, husband. You are a wife before God before you are a mother. You want to know why most couples divorce when their children go to college? Because they spent all of their lives, all of those last 20 or 25 years, working on making sure their kids were taken care of. They got everything that they needed. They got everywhere they needed to go. And then when they leave the house and mom and dad are by themselves again, you know what they realize? They don't know each other. The truth of the matter is, and I don't like to think about my kids growing up and leaving either, but the truth of the matter is, I'm raising my boys to leave. And I married my wife to stay. And if I don't love their mother, I will end up hurting them in the long run. We have to remember the order in which these things should take precedence. Number whatever this is, we have to resolve. We have to have resolve that says, I'm going to stick with this. 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verses 7 and 8, as he speaks of love, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. It stays with it. You know the line from the old song that says, sometimes love just ain't enough? That's a lie. If it is biblical love, it will always be enough. Always. Love, verse 8, love never fails. Love never ends. It'll always be enough. It's refusing to give up on one another. Even when, and by the way, this is where, when I see, divorce bothers me no matter who it happens to. But it really bothers me when I see young couples and they're a year or two in and they're divorcing because we just had this disagreement, this strong disagreement. We're not compatible. Yes, you are. We don't have an intimate relationship, but you don't understand. Intimacy is on the other side of conflict. Intimacy is on the other side of your differences. When you're willing to come together and work out your problems and say, I'm willing to surrender this. I'm willing to surrender this. I love you enough to give up my rights to you. And we work through these things together. That's at the moment when they are most primed to learn what God intended marriage to be, when they're primed to learn the blessing that marriage is, they're walking away from each other. And it's so incredibly sad. Then finally, we need to remember just the simple rule of kindness. Love is patient and kind. I've heard a number of people through the years try to say, you know what, we're married, we should be able to just talk straight to each other. Now, what they mean by talking straight, and a lot of people who say, I just tell it like it is. Let me explain to you people who tell it like it is. People who tell it like it is, that only applies to them. You're not allowed to tell them like it is. That is nothing but a cover for being a bully. That's all it is. And furthermore, if you can find me a passage in Scripture that says it's okay for you to be unkind to somebody, I'll pile 100 up that say it's not. Don't you find it interesting that we can be more patient with a store clerk who gets something wrong than we can our spouse? That we can be more gentle with them than we can our spouse? You need to hurry up. Come on. Now, you wouldn't do that to anybody else in this room, but you do it to them. Well, we're married. We know we don't mean it. You better be careful of that. I have yet to find the passage that says it's okay to be unkind because it's my spouse and they know I love them. I can yell at you. I can roll my eyes at you, which, by the way, rolling eyes at a spouse is probably one of the most damaging things you can do because it means you're becoming apathetic and you don't really care what they think. You honestly consider them to be just a joke, basically. It's extremely damaging. Why is it wrong? Why is it too much to ask to say, could not yell it, And by the way, you don't have to raise your voice. People say sometimes, I've been in this situation, they say, but I didn't yell at him. Yeah, but you and I both know you don't have to yell at somebody to be condescending to them. We all know that, surely. Whatever happened to please and thank you? I shouldn't have to tell them thank you. They should. Okay. You're welcome to that. But you'll not be free from the consequences of that choice, I promise you. So what we have to understand, and these are just a few things, if we're going to build an intimate marriage, it's not going to happen without work. It's not going to happen without learning how to bite your tongue. You can be truthful with how you feel without being harsh in how you express it. But ultimately, I'm going to venture to say that 99% of us, we married our spouses because we liked them. And I think it's the saddest reality on earth that a lot of people who are married to each other, they don't like each other anymore. And they say, but I would die for you. Yeah, but here's my question. If you're willing to die for them, why aren't you willing to live for them? Because taking a bullet and dying is a one-time action that's easy. Getting up and dying to yourself every day to meet the needs of another person is hard. But that's where marriage thrives. That's where intimacy thrives. And lest we forget, this marriage is an illustration of the gospel. So tonight, if a person is outside of Jesus, we invite you into the church, the bride of Christ. It belongs to Christ. With a penitent faith, confessing Jesus, to be immersed in water for the forgiveness of your sins. Become a part of this bride, which has a bridegroom who makes no mistakes, who does no wrong. Or maybe we haven't been faithful to Jesus, the perfect bridegroom, or maybe we're struggling and things along those ways. I understand marriage especially marriage struggles are a difficult issue, and I can completely understand the person not wanting to make that a known fact publicly. But I do want to say this. If you or somebody you know is struggling in their relationship, their marriage relationship, don't wait until you think it's time to get help. You need to get help long before that. Because by the time that people come to counselors or come to someone to seek good advice, their relationship many times is so disintegrated, it's almost impossible to put back together. Seek it earlier than you think you need it. And God will help you. And we're happy to help you. And if we need to pray together tonight about our relationship with God, our relationship with other people, or just privately have a discussion, we're happy to do that as well. If we can help you tonight, let us know as we stand and sing this song.